guys, welcome back to the Andrew and Show. I'm so glad that you've tuned in for this episode. Man, I am pumped about today's conversation. If you're like me and you're on social media, you've heard a lot about the quote-unquote Palestinian conflict, what's going on in Israel, and you've probably heard so many different perspectives that Israel is committing genocide or committing war crimes, or maybe Hamas is the problem, and are they freedom fighters? Are they actually terrorists? What's it like actually living in Israel? Because we're constantly hearing headlines and news. Well, in this episode, we're going to go a little bit beyond those headlines. We're going to try to actually have a deep, meaningful conversation. And it just so happens that I can have it with a good friend of mine who I haven't talked to in like a long time, but then we reconnected online. So I want to introduce my good friend, Shaun. So Shaun and I, we met years ago in the Speech and Debate League and became good friends there and then got a little bit disconnected. But Shaun, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Dude, absolutely. So here's the cool thing about Shaun. If you see his screen, it looks like he's at the beach because I think he is at the beach. Dude, that's cool, man. So which part of Israel are you at?
I'm in Haifa, so it's considered northern Israel. Kind of have the south
Okay.
center, the north center is like Tel Aviv, south Beersheba. I'm up north, Haifa,
Yeah.
closer to like Lebanon.
Dude. Okay, got you. So
Yeah.
here's why I'm so pumped about this conversation. Not only because Shaun is a good friend, and it feels like with these type of quote unquote controversial conversations, you at least have to have some type of friendship. If not, like people, I don't know, get weird about it. But also because you're actually living in Israel. So there's one thing doing investigations, there's one thing looking up, which again, you can find a lot of objective sources. But I don't know, man. I feel like this conversation with you, we're going to dive deep. I mean, I kind of sent you some of the questions where for those who are listening to this, I just want you to have an open heart, open mind, because we're going to talk about why it matters that we're talking about this, because there's plenty of podcasts, there's plenty of information online. But first, Shaun, I wanted to just ask you, man, obviously you're living in Israel, but what's your connection to Israel? Are you there? Are you touristing or what's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I grew up in a Jewish family. My mom's side of the family is fully Jewish. My dad's side of the family
Okay.
isn't. And my mom
Okay.
grew up in a fairly religious Jewish house. Right now, she's a believer. She believes in Jesus. But when she was a kid, she did not grow up that way. She grew up in a regular Jewish household. And one thing
Mm-hmm.
that's important to know is for most Jews, especially like American Jews, if you grew up in a Jewish home that's connected to the Jewish culture, it's impossible to separate that from Israel. They're directly connected. You'll grow up hearing all the stories from the Bible, the Old Testament about the ancient Israelites. It's seen as the Jewish homeland. That's where Jews
Mm-hmm.
come over the thousands of years. They were kind of spread out through different expulsions.
Mm-hmm.
Empire kind of being the last before the recreation of the state of Israel. And so it's always seen as the Jewish homeland. It's where we come from. And there's always been a longing, a desire to go back. When the Jews
Mm-hmm.
didn't have Israel before 1948, when they were in Europe and South America, all throughout the globe, this was something that they longed for. And if you read Jewish literature, if you read from Jewish scholars, there's kind of this idea that we want to go back to our homeland. And so if you grew up in a
Mm-hmm.
Jewish house, you're going to read these things, you're going to hear these things every Passover. It's a holiday you might be familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Pesach. Every Passover at the end of a Seder will say like next year in Jerusalem. Like there's this desire, like maybe we aren't in Israel at the moment, but
Yeah.
we hope next year we'll be there with the Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
So that was
Mm-hmm.
the initial connection, was just growing up in a Jewish home because my mom's side of the family was Jewish. You grew up learning like this is your homeland, this is where your people come from. You read the Bible, and most of it takes place in Israel, and it's about the ancient Israelites, and it's impossible to separate that. There's just this
Yeah.
idea that's our homeland. Eventually, my sister and brother moved here when they were 18. They've been living here for 10 years, 5 years for my sister,
Oh
and I
wow.
moved here to do studies. I've been living here at least 2 years.
Wow. So I think you mentioned something interesting at the beginning. One, you grew up in a Jewish household, even your mom is. Um, so actually, here's one terminology. So would you be considered like a Messianic Jew or just a Christian or Jew? Like, what's the terminology? Like, how do you refer to yourself? I know we like to throw out like
Wow.
a lot of labels and
Yeah.
stuff, but I don't know. I'm curious.
No, it's a good question. I think I'm a little different. I like to keep things simple,
Okay.
so I tell people I'm a Jewish believer in Jesus. So like my
I love
identity
that.
is my culture essentially I see as Jewish. My ethnicity is Jewish. My belief is in Jesus. Like I believe he's my savior. That he's God
Hmm.
and he died for our sins, rose from the dead, those things.
Yeah.
I don't get too much into like religious terminology, Christian, Messianic, Jewish, because sometimes there's different definitions of these things. Messianic Jewish in
Yeah.
America is a little different from Messianic Jewish in Israel. They don't look
Oh,
completely
really? I had
actually.
no
Yeah,
idea.
the way the service is in, the way that people live day to day, it's slightly different sometimes. So I keep it simple,
Gotcha.
but you could say maybe Messianic Jew is one way to that's what I grew up as. But
Right, right. But I love that kind of keeping it simple. As, hey, I'm Jewish and I believe in Jesus. It's like, which I think that should be like everybody's, label, whatever your culture is. It's like, hey, yeah, I'm Mexican, whatever. But obviously, it's a little bit more unique. Well, you mentioned something interesting because I talk to my parents and to people a lot. I don't necessarily respond to a lot of like culture, even though I have a podcast. But some of it, I'm like, man, there's just so much going on. I don't have time to respond to it, but I'm constantly chewing on what's being said online and on different podcasts and everything. And one thing that you mentioned kind of highlighted some things that I've heard even more recently, especially with everything that's going on in Israel right now and Israel's response to Hamas's attack. And there seems to be an opposition, culturally speaking, whether it's in universities, and we'll get to that, against Israel. And then there's like a separation that people go, oh, wait. No, we're not anti-Jew. We're just anti-Israel. Like, we're anti the state of Israel, but like, this is not anti-Semitic. And there's this idea that you can be uh, anti-Israel and not anti-Semitic. And because maybe another term we can get to it, which I've heard a lot, is like you can be anti-Zionist and
Right,
not
right.
that's a
anti-Semitic, right?
very
And it
popular
almost
one.
sounds like a scary word. Like, what in the world is a Zionist? Anyways,
Right.
so I like to kind of get into that. Like, can you separate those things, or what does it even mean when people say I'm anti-Israel but not anti-Semitic? Like, how would you describe those, and can you separate them?
Yeah, I think it's good to separate all these things into different categories, if you will. Anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitism. I think it depends on what someone means. You have to ask them, what
Okay.
do you mean by anti-Israel? And if someone is anti-Israel and their definition of what that means to be anti-Israel, if that definition is someone that doesn't accept Israel's right to exist, they don't see Israel as a legitimate nation. They see this as
Mm,
not Israel, but all Palestine. Israel is not a legitimate nation. It's a nation of white colonizers that came and conquered and took the land.
right.
Uh, it's not indigenous to Jews. It has no right to self-defense. It has no right to autonomy. If this is your idea of anti-Israel, essentially saying this country shouldn't even exist, that I see as anti-Semitic. And the reason why is as Jews, we see this as our homeland. We see it as the place
Right.
we came from. So denying Jews the right to live in their own home, the right to autonomy and self-defense in their homeland, I think it's one of the most anti-Semitic things you could do. Especially
Yeah.
when you the reason why many Jews came to Israel in the early 1900s was the increase of anti-Semitism in Europe, in Russia, throughout the globe, and Jews didn't feel safe when they weren't in their own homeland. And
Hmm.
so denying Jews that right to live in their homeland, to say that it's not even the place they came from, I see that as very
Hmm.
anti-Semitic. Also, if your idea of anti-Israel means treating the country differently than you would treat every other country, it's essentially holding it to a standard that's unrealistic that you wouldn't do with other countries. I think that can also fall into anti-Semitism. You'll see as part of the anti-Israel movement, mass boycotting, right? Israeli athletes, actresses, singers, it doesn't really matter who, as long as they come from Israel. It doesn't matter their beliefs, their opinions. If they're Israeli, we boycott them. We want nothing to do with them, right? I see that as problematic because we don't often
Mhm.
hold these standards to other nations.
Right.
Holding the Jewish nation to a standard you won't hold anyone else to, it's problematic. It's anti-Semitic. But if your definition of anti-Israel means, look, I have a problem with the Israeli government or with Netanyahu, right?
Mhm.
Or
Right.
with the army, with the war, right? I don't like the way the war is being handled. I don't like how it's being fought. Criticizing Israel and its government, that's not anti-Semitic, and that's something that really needs to be clear because you can also create issues if you call everything anti-Semitic. Even before the war started, there was already protesting, major things going on internally in the country with the current government because many Israelis have issues with what's going on here.
Yeah.
But I think you have to ask someone what they really mean by this when they're talking language that sounds anti-Israel. If you want to determine if they're saying things that are anti-Semitic that really need to be addressed, like this is not okay, it's anti-Semitic. I have to ask them
Mhm.
what they really believe. Do you believe Israel should exist? Do you believe there should only be a Palestine? Do
Right.
you think be an Israel and a Palestine? Like these kind of questions, and I think that will help you decide if it's anti-Semitic or just criticism of Israel.
Just criticism. And how would you define Zionism or like anti-Zionism? Because I feel like that has become almost like a buzzword that some people say. So I'm not sure how would you define that?
Yeah, I think it's important to know like Zionism. There's always been different kinds if you look at its history. There's been
Okay.
different kinds of Zionists, if you will, and what they believe. But put really, really simply, Zionism is essentially the ideology, the belief that this land, Israel, is the Jewish homeland, and that Jews have the right to return and to live in that homeland. Just very put simply, that's Zionism. And then you have different maybe ideas of what that means. You might have more extremist forms where it means at any cost, right? Like doesn't matter who it affects, as long as Jews can come here and live here, that's what matters most, right? Doesn't matter who else that
Mhm.
affects. But you have other forms. What I believe in Zionism is just that simple statement. If you're Jewish, I believe you have a right to live in Israel as a citizen. It's your homeland. That's it.
Yeah.
Like that's Zionism. It's as simple as that. And now it's been turned into so many different definitions. It's sad it's been used almost as another word for racism, essentially, like a way to call somebody something, just, oh, you're a Zionist. And it just immediately somehow
Yeah.
means we're in this category
It.
of a racist. We don't talk to them, we don't deal with them because they're a Zionist.
Yeah, because there's quote. Yeah.
What that means.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that is a huge problem because most Jews agree with this idea. There are many Jews that aren't pro-Israel, but if you ask the average Jew in America, they tend to be supportive of the state of Israel. They believe it should exist, and they believe it's the Jewish homeland. And then obviously Jews here in Israel, right? There's over 6 million
Right.
Jews living in Israel. It's close, a little more than I think the Jewish population in America, but most Jews, if you look at one place where they're all together, this is where most Jews exist in one group. So
Yeah.
if anything, that should be like the Jewish population to look to. And most of them are Zionists. So what happens is now you have this idea, oh, if someone's a Zionist, they're racist, they're white supremacist, therefore they're bad. I can call them whatever I want. I can target
Right.
them however I want. It can very become a slippery slope because most Jews are Zionists. So then you end up seeing anti-Zionist hatred and targeting end up
Yeah.
just being a Jew. And that's a problem.
Exactly.
And that's why we've seen a huge increase in like anti-Semitism in the globe, whether it's like desecration of Jewish like cemeteries or keeping Jews
Mm.
from getting to synagogues, just blocking them on campuses. We
Right.
saw it all over. It was very crazy, but it was simple. It's just label them as Zionist. Now it's okay what we do to them. And that's a problem. If you think about the definition of Zionism is just a very simple definition. Jews have the right
You
to
know.
Israel and to return. And that's it.
Exactly. Exactly. No, Shaun, thanks for kind of breaking that down because I think it's really important that you brought up a really good point, which is one, if you're curious, investigate what people really mean when they use terms because a lot of terms are thrown out. I think a lot of people don't even know what they mean when they use a lot of terms. But you're right. I think the Zionism has been used almost as calling someone a Nazi or calling someone a like, it's just like, what is a label, which is totally against what the label even the word even means, but the feeling of it, it's almost like, how can I label someone so they don't actually become a human being, they just become a bad guy, an enemy.
Exactly.
Know?
No, Shaun, thanks for kind of breaking that down.
Exactly. That's what you were mentioning. It's almost like
right.
a racist term in some sense,
right.
that blocks any conversation. And I think that's a huge problem right now in our culture, in our cultural environment, is that we're seeing each other too much as enemies, and like, actually, like, the other side is evil. That's what, and if you hold that, then yeah, why would you talk to evil people, right? You don't. You would talk to someone who might be reasonable, but when you label someone with the charged word now, a Zionist or whatever it is, it gives you an excuse to treat them wrongly, to discriminate against them, like we've seen that those upticks. And it's I feel like it was like the wave that we saw here in the U.S. during like 2020 and the BLM riots, where like now any white person was just a white supremacist, and it was, forget it, you don't have to talk to them, you already know them, and you can treat them however you want because they're just a white supremacist. It's all these terms are kind of thrown around. But I think everyone watching, like, again, what the simple definition of Zionism is not any extreme or anything like that.
It's just, hey,
Israel has a homeland. It's always been Israel's homeland, and we'll get to that. And it has a right to exist.
Right.
They're not. You don't have to jump to absolutes where, like, oh, if I'm quote unquote pro-Israel, now I'm pro every single little thing that happens.
Right.
Well, that doesn't exist anywhere. And maybe that's what you were saying. Like, we hold Israel to such standards where, like, if you say you're pro-Israel, you must support everything. Where I'm like, hey, if I'm a conservative in the U.S., doesn't mean I support everything that the Republican Party might be doing, or someone who calls themselves a conservative, right?
I just understand the principles.
No, I mean, it's like you said, we have to be really careful. And it's too often I've had these conversations with people. I love Jews, even Israelis I'm okay with. I just hate Zionists. Those are the people I have problems with. And when you hear this from somebody, you have to really step back and say, okay, what does this mean? Because most Israelis are Zionists and most Jews are Zionists, right? Like, maybe they don't self-identify all the time with that because of that term being used constantly back and forth, but they agree with that idea that Israel has the right to exist, that it's the Jewish homeland. And so you have to be careful when people start using this word. It can become a very, very, very easy excuse to then target Jewish people. If we just have labeled them as a Zionist, then whatever we do or say to them, it's okay now because they're a Zionist, right? So we have to be very careful with that terminology.
Exactly. Well, I want to ask you, obviously, and this is going to take a deep turn here, because these things have consequences. How we label people, how the whole narratives, they're not just words. They're not, I think so many times we live in an isolated bubble of social media and think that we can just either post anything or just, I don't know, as if the outside world doesn't exist. But I feel like that was completely shattered last year on October 7th. And I wanted to ask you, where were you that day? Where were you when you found out about all the horrific things that happened? I mean, just walk us through kind of your thoughts, your feelings during that day.
Yeah. I mean, we're coming up on the anniversary pretty soon in a few weeks, and already when he was talking about what that's going to look like. It feels like yesterday. I'll be honest. It really feels like yesterday. It was a Saturday morning. I remember very clear. The way things work here in the believing community, most communities meet on Saturday, on Shabbat. And just because of the way the country functions, Sunday is like a work day. So the weekend actually starts like Friday, Saturday's the weekend, and then Sunday it's like so no one Sunday just because they have to go to work. So it was Saturday morning. I was going to my congregation. And I saw something on the news like, oh, there's some rockets that have been fired, and there are some rumors, maybe there's something more. Didn't think too much about it. And then during the service, more and more stuff was coming out like, okay, there's been infiltration, there's active terrorists inside Israeli cities. it was a very different situation than just a rocket attack launch that had happened. So the service was paused and we did an immediate like prayer. And so we got all in groups, small groups of like 6 to 7 people, and just prayed for the situation. We didn't really know what was going on. We just knew something not good has happened. So we were just praying for soldiers that were going to be responding and police officers and anyone who was in at risk at the moment. We prayed for Gaza. We prayed for Palestinians. Even some prayed for Hamas, like, that they would turn from the evil that they were doing at that moment. And that was something I will never forget, just to see everyone was in a little bit of shock. And then when we all went home in the afternoon, and more came out. And yeah, I didn't sleep for a few days. I really didn't, because there was already like active terrorist infiltration that lasted for some time. It took a time for them to even get, I believe it's a few thousand Hamas soldiers, they said, that crossed over. And so it took time for them to get them out of the Israeli cities on this side of the border. And then little things would come out more and more. Okay, there's hostages. That was immediately like a shocker to most people. We knew that that's not going to be good. There's been history of kidnappings, and every time it just leads to a horrible situation. And then there was the whole report that came out about the Nova Massacre. I'm not sure if you heard about that, but a festival that was close to the border, where hundreds of young adults were just slaughtered and kidnapped. And they didn't know about that until a little bit later, because it wasn't in the main city. It was like kind of like a rave, to be honest, but often the dead. So then when they finally got there, there was just nobody that had been there. So little by little, just hear more and more horror stories. And it changed everything in this country, everyone and everything. You can't ever go back to how it was before that. It really was the worst day in Israel's history and one of the worst days in Jewish history. So that's where I was here. I had been here already for a year. And yeah, I was in Israel when it happened. And
yeah, something truly horrific. I mean, it just came to mind for people to have an idea of, at least here in the U.S., where less the younger generation not to have experienced something like that, but the old generation might have experienced some 9/11. But really, it's like a Pearl Harbor attack on a Sunday, And I'm not in any way comparing it, but just wanted to give the people an idea of, this is an off day, this is a holy day, and this is not when society is necessarily rolling. Everyone's resting. Everyone's, like you said, going to service, going to synagogue, and then this horrific thing happens. I wanted to ask you, there is a sense in people, and again, we don't necessarily have to dive into details and all that, because it is very traumatic, but I've seen in culture that there's a sense in people of almost denial of it even happening, denial of the extent that it happened. Again, it's almost like Zionist propaganda, we're told, and in order to justify a harsh response of a warmonger. You know how all these terms are thrown around. But
yeah.
What has, since that day, you mentioned it's never been the same. Since that day, what has changed in the feeling of the country? What has changed in the feeling of, as a Jew, even, like, have you felt safe since that day? How has that affected your kind of your life since October 7th last year?
Yeah. I mean, just to address the first thing you mentioned about the denial, that is, it shocked me how much that I saw this. I didn't think that would even be possible, but the amount of rumors and lies that either Israel exaggerated it, even more to the extent like Israel did this, right? Like they were IDF soldiers doing these things, and the Zionists, and it's hard to even believe someone could hate Israel this much to come to these just absurd conclusions. But the footage is there. I don't know if you watched it. There were videos.
I watched to be honest, very little of it. I couldn't take it, you know. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there were videos that were on like social media, but those were the ones that were allowed to be on social media. But there
Yeah.
is like there's official website they created that has just documented all the videos and photos, and it's there. Like the evidence is there. It's the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. I've seen Holocaust footage, and this by far was more traumatic and more horrific than any of those. Um,
Mhm.
and that was so hard for me to see people getting to these conclusions. It was truly just horrible, like unimaginable what happened here. And yeah, after that, to follow up on the other question, it left the country different. I think the biggest thing is because it's a small country, right? It's not a very big country. I think the population's like 9 million or so, 6 million Jews and about 2 million Arab Israelis, with other
Mhm.
smaller populations as well. Not a big country. Dallas is, I think DFW is maybe, 6
Uh,
million, something
yeah,
like that.
something like that.
At least like half. That's just DFW. That's half of the entire country
Yeah.
here. So imagine something like this happening like in your Dallas DFW complex, right? Like it, everyone would know about it. Everyone would be talking about it. Everyone would be in shock. And everyone would know someone affected by it. And that's the biggest thing is I haven't met anyone that either had someone that they lost or knew someone that lost someone close. I
Mm.
didn't know anyone in particular, but multiple people from my congregation knew people. One of my good friends, she's in the army. Two of her close army friends were killed on the 7th. My brother, one of his good army friends, he's known for 10 years, was one of the first responders. So he was
Wow.
trying to fight the initial invasion, and he also was killed. And that's just me. I've only lived here 2 years, and I've already
Right.
made connections with close friends who lost people on the 7th. Another one of my friends, he lost a classmate. She was kidnapped and then killed in Gaza. So I haven't been here that long, and I already have close connections to people that lost people on that day.
Mhm.
Um, if you grew up in this country, it's impossible. Like it's affected everyone. It's too small. And so that's why afterwards there was just this heaviness that's still kind of existent. It's hard to explain, but there's just I've never seen so much grief in my life. Never seen so much grief
Mm.
in a country before. And just everywhere you go, it's just doesn't matter where. There's just heaviness because everyone lost someone close. And to see people my age, our age, we're young. It's not normal to
Yeah.
see people our age burying friends, family members. It's not. It's not something you see,
No.
experience. It's completely abnormal, actually. And that was really hard to see. And the heaviness didn't leave people. There's a lot of, PTSD that's increasing as well, um, in the country, which is it's hard. And then right after
Mhm.
that, after the war started, you had a massive call up for reserves. I don't know if you know how the country works here, but most people go into the army in Israel. It's mandatory.
Okay.
It's a hard
Okay.
service for Jewish Israelis at least. So everyone goes into the army, age 18. They usually serve 2 to 3 years, and then they're in the reserves. And they're in the reserves for quite some time. So when the war started, most of the men in the reserves got called back. And so on top of everyone processing what had happened, you had so many fathers and young men being called back into the army, many of them to go into Gaza. So on top of that, then you
Mm.
had alone, you had parents that had young kids that had been called up going back.
Oh my gosh.
It just also shook the entire country because everyone that was doing their normal daily life, their normal job, doctors that I knew got called up. It didn't
Wow.
really matter who you were. You got called up, you have to go fight now. You're in the reserves. And so that
Wow.
also shook the country up, and it's still kind of figuring out what to do because there's only so many soldiers they had, so they called up a many, and that completely changed the way
Right.
the country functions because everyone was in the reserves, professors, students, everyone. They're in the reserves, so everyone had to go into the army, figure out their new position, and that also
Mhm.
changed the country. And with time, I mean, many hundreds of soldiers have died and even more been injured since the war has started. There's a believing family I know well, and one of their sons died in Gaza. I went to his funeral.
Mm.
So that also shook the country because it wasn't like it just ended. The continuation of all its effects of knowing people fighting in Gaza. I know many people that have been in Gaza, many close friends. It changes them. They don't come back this.
I think one of the points that not a lot of people think about is the proportions of the population size. You know, we think in America we are 300 million. I mean, we're just millions of people here in America. And even then, we hear about some tragic news that involve 2, 3, 5 people, and we feel it, of course, because we're Americans. And it can be I'm in Texas, it can be in Massachusetts, you know, I mean, the shootings that happen, and they're horrible things. And we can be affected. And one thing is that versus being such a tight-knit community in a small country. And like you said, there's always someone affected. You've mentioned friends that you have that go serve, they don't come back the same. And what's been the response, like your honest thoughts, feedback of like the response of even people that you know of just I'll label it the Christian community in general, the Christian community. What's been kind of the response after October 7th from like the Christian community?
I think, to be honest, it kind of felt, and at least the people I knew in the Christian community, very half and half response, like very split. The biggest way I could describe it is it seemed almost as if it was seen like another political issue. And there's one side here, and then like right in the middle, people that just didn't want to get involved. It reminded me a lot of like past conflicts I had, conversations with people on, the BLM conflict that was going on in the US.
Right.
Within the church, there was a lot of different ideas going on, and a lot of people in the middle, but it was seen as like a political issue, right? Like maybe you could think this way, maybe you could think that way. At the end of the day, it's not the most important thing, right? You're pro-vax or not pro-vax, whatever. It was kind of seen as
right. Everyone's got their
opinion to it, and I don't want to get too political, so I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, and so I kind of felt the exact same response with the current war situation. Some people just feel like they don't know enough about it. They're not educated enough. And that's why they just didn't have so much an opinion on it, or they just saw it as another big political thing, a global political affair that they didn't really feel like they wanted to get involved with, or they felt a connection to. And my honest thoughts on that, it was hard. It was disappointing. It was really disappointing, because I think it really showed me the disconnection that so much American Christianity has with the rest of the believing community, like the rest of the body of Christ. There should be more of a union, right? A community connection between believers all over the globe. And I really saw it as, okay, there really is almost this American Christianity that doesn't always know what's going on with other Christians globally. And the reason I say that is because if they really understood and were connected to the core of believers in this country, it wouldn't be a political issue. It would be seen as like, okay, there are believers in Israel that think a certain way and are going through a certain thing, and we want to support them.
Wow.
And I say that because in this country, among the believing, I'm saying believing as like evangelical Christian, just so that's clear. You have, different kinds of denominations.
Sure.
You have Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, which doesn't totally fit into this type of thinking necessarily, but among what we would call evangelical Christian believing community in the land of Israel, it's almost impossible to find someone that is anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, BDS. It doesn't exist. All the believers here they're unified. They're unified about this idea of this is our homeland. We have a right to defend. We support the soldiers going into Gaza to take back the hostages and fight Hamas. There's no conflict. It's not confusing. It's not a political issue. In my congregation
There's
alone,
not a lot of nuance attached to it.
Congregation to congregation, there's people in the army fighting in Gaza. It's not a confusing thing. It's very clear to believers where they stand on this. And that was sad to see. It's amazing you don't have this in the US, but it's so amazing to be like in a congregation and talk to people our age, and it's a young man, a young soldier who's going to go into Gaza, and they're asking for prayer requests because
Wow.
they say I'm going to be in a situation, that's going to be hard. There's going to be people next to me that want revenge. Like, please pray that I won't go in there with the heart of revenge, right? That I'd go in guided to make the right decisions as a soldier, to do
Mm.
the right thing as a believer. Like, it's not something you'll have a conversation with this. And then multiple times every week in the beginning, we would pray for the soldiers, believing soldiers going into Gaza, that this would happen, that they wouldn't act out of vengeance and revenge, because
Mm.
the Bible tells us that we don't take revenge. It's not in our hands, but justice has to be done. And we also have to get back the hostages. Like, we can't just let something
Yeah.
like that. Um, that was incredible to see, to be honest. It
Mm.
really shook. It's like, it was so sincere, and so deep. Uh, and yeah, there also, I have connection with somebody who knows believers in Gaza. She's an Arab Christian family. She comes from an Arab Christian family. She has friends and family that is in Gaza, and incredibly difficult for what they're going through right now.
Oh my gosh.
So
Yeah.
also always important to keep them in mind as well. It's something we haven't talked about. Been talking more
Hmm.
about that in Israeli because that's what I am. I live here. I know the
Right.
perspective, but um, all of this said, it's not to take away what's going on over there as well, and the believers that are also suffering in Gaza. And I saw this connection almost from American Christianity to knowing what's going on to their fellow brothers and sisters in Christ in Gaza and in Israel. Just, it was sad to see.
Wow.
Um, it just got treated as another political issue, and I really don't think it should be. I think if you understood and if you're connected to your other brethren, you would see,
Yeah.
okay, what's going on here? There's really a good evil situation going on here. Um,
Wow.
and yeah,
No, thank you for mentioning that, because I think you touched on a very important point, that you're absolutely right. It got treated as another political dilemma for people to have their perspectives. And it's almost like, this is my perspective. I'm not saying I'm diagnosing it correctly, but it's on the left, side of the aisle, and the extreme left. Well, they're anti-Israel anyways and anti-Semitic. So they're just like, I saw, people posting parachute pictures of freedom fighters, and you're just like, okay, yeah, you're definitely support terrorists. There was that kind of quote unquote more extreme side. But then even on the more conservative side, then you saw on the political, you saw people not taking this as a serious situation, and instead taking this as like, well, here it goes again, the media using another situation to get us into an endless war, and then all of a sudden got like into a political dilemma where you're absolutely right. I was trying to think, I'm like, I don't think there's ever been, and maybe there has been, I haven't been alive for that long, but another, let's just say, crisis among whether it's an ethnicity, but even fellow believers. Like, people forget that there are Jewish fellow believers, and one, as Christians, we have a connection to Judaism anyway, so we'll talk about that. But where instead of first praying and feeling compassion and helping, we take a step back and go, what is the political landscape of that land before I react to this? If some persecution in India happens and you're like, I don't know which side to take, who was, and you're like, that never happens. But it totally happened with this. And then that kind of takes me into next kind of two questions. One is definitely want to go into kind of the war and Israel's response, because now when you bring up Israel, it almost feels like October 7th has disappeared in people's minds. And now it's just Israel's actions against Gaza and against, quote unquote, the Palestinians. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned something important. It's important to talk about and keep even the Palestinians in our prayers, everything that they're going through, because the way that this is framed is Israel versus Palestinians. It's like some categorize as evil Israel, but it's just like this state of government power Israel versus helpless Palestinians. In reality, what's the relationship in general like between Palestinians and Israel? Like, how because it's a small country. I mean, things are, I'm sure, interconnected. Is the war Palestinians versus Israelis?
no, I mean, it from an Israeli perspective, it's very clear. This is a war of Israel and Hamas, right? Like, we are
Okay.
fighting Hamas. We're not fighting the Palestinian people. there is a terrorist entity that is governing Gaza that started October 7th, right? Raped, massacred, murdered, kidnapped civilians, elderly, children, women, it didn't matter. We have to respond to that. And so there's a very clear mindset for Israelis in general. Like, this is not about even necessarily the whole Palestinian Israeli conflict. This is a response against Hamas. Like, we have to fight Hamas. We have to keep them accountable. We have to get back Israeli citizens that are currently held in Gaza. So no, it's not a Israel versus Palestinian people issue, which I think it's sad if it gets broken down into that. It's the interaction. I don't know if I can say I'm the best one to describe that,
Sure.
because there's it's very complicated, because you have many different denominations that have different experiences in this land. So
Of course.
someone who is living in Gaza is going to have a very different experience in the relations. A Palestinian in Gaza would have different experiences with Israelis than a Palestinian in the West Bank, or an Arab Israeli that's an Israeli citizen, or a member
Right.
of the Bedouin community, or a member of the Arab Druze community. So there's multiple communities of Arabs and Palestinians throughout the land that have different experiences. I can't speak on their behalf.
Mhm.
From the Israeli side, I can say that this current conflict is not seen as we are trying to fight Palestinians or fight Arabs. We're fighting Hamas. And what's
Mhm.
going on in the north, it's Hezbollah. We're fighting Hezbollah. We're not trying to fight the Lebanese
Right.
people. We're fighting Hezbollah, which is another terrorist organization that's been
Yeah.
causing issues
Oh
lately.
man.
So yeah, that needs to be made really clear. There are many Arab Christians in the community that I'm in. I have many Arab Christian friends. In the healthcare community, many of the doctors are Israeli Arabs and students. So it depends on what you're talking about, that relation.
Of course.
It is very complicated. I think more than you can get into in this, but
No, I think that's an apt response, because you're absolutely right. There's a lot of specifics, people's interactions, and all that. It's like when you'd ask me, how are race relations in America? Well, I said, well, it depends. But generally speaking, what you said, the response of Israel is not against Palestinians, and I think that is very, very clear, and that should be known for everyone watching right now, because there is such a bent of a narrative against Israel, saying, Israel is committing ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians. I mean, all these quote unquote buzzwords that are serious accusations, they're serious charges, but they're just kind of thrown out. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the war again from your perspective. I know you don't represent anybody or everybody, but I still love to hear one of the questions, and it might be we'll kind of move through them, but one of the words I keep hearing is Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. How would you respond to that? I mean, is that true, or what's actually going on?
yeah, I think we have to even ask, why did this word come to be? Like, why are we
Hmm.
using this one? And I don't think it's coincidental. It's some of what we talked about. This is my opinion, but it's something that we talked about even earlier. The very easy slope of blending anti-Zionism, anti-Israel with anti-Semitism. And I don't think it's coincidental that the rhetoric that was chosen to target Israel was the same rhetoric that was created to describe the Holocaust, right? So
Hmm.
the most traumatic event that happened to the Jewish people, 6 million Jews, 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe was exterminated. That's where the word genocide came from. Like, it was created to describe an
Wow.
event humanity really didn't see before. And to take that word that was used and created to describe a Jewish event to target Jews themselves, saying they're now the new ones committing this. I don't think
Hmm.
it's coincidental. I really don't. I think it's part of this underlying anti-Semitism that you see in many of these movements. Um, to take a word that has very deep meaning to Jews, like that word genocide, we immediately think of the Holocaust. It has very deep meaning.
Right.
And then to us, the people committing that, yeah, I don't think it's coincidental. But to
Hmm.
get into the idea, isn't it? Look, I don't think it is. I think that's absurd. There are many clear recorded genocides. The Holocaust is the main one we have. And in that one, Like I said, about 2/3 of the population was exterminated. Armenian genocide is another one people have talked about many times. I believe it was around half of the population that was exterminated, and it didn't matter who, right? It didn't matter if you're woman, elderly, child, man, because of who you were seen as the problem, as the enemy. What's going on in Gaza is very different. It's a war in one of the most highly dense populations in the globe, right? Gaza is also not a large location, has over 2 million Palestinians in a very small part of land. And it's extremely dense. And you can't conduct a war in something like that and not have civilian casualties, not have bad things occur. It doesn't mean the war is a genocide, that you're rounding up everyone you can, you're exterminating any person on site. They're fighting Hamas. That's what they're doing. Hamas is a military. They have weapons, like they are an organized military that they're fighting, that conducts its operations within a highly populated civilian location. They fight from schools and mosques and hospitals and apartment buildings. It doesn't matter where, that's where they operate. When you're fighting those people in a civilian area, bad things happen. It's the horrible thing of war. It's what's sad.
Yeah.
It's terrible. It's tragic. It's a horrible thing. War is not a good thing. It's a horrible thing. But to then call that genocide is just, it's not logical. There's not an indiscriminate targeting of every single Palestinian individual. There is a clear war going on, fighting against Hamas, which we know is comprised of thousands of individuals they have families as well. And when you're fighting them, things happen. But statistically, it's not a genocide. If you understand what's actually going on the ground, it's not a genocide. It's a war. They're not the same thing.
No, I think that's a powerful statement. That you're absolutely right. I think genocide and a war is not the same thing. And I had never thought about that, of the implications of trying to use that term against the Jews, of genocide, and what they're doing, what they're actually operating in Gaza against Hamas. You know, that's interesting when you talk about war, because for you and I, that makes sense, but that assumes that it's a just war, and that assumes that, right, Israel is a legitimate government and a legitimate state. But there's a narrative that says Israel's not even supposed to be there. You know, that's not, they're quote unquote colonizers. I have no idea who got away with that. That seems to be the most ironic term. But trying to quote unquote take it seriously is, okay, so Israel's I'm just kind of spitting out these narratives because here's what I believe people are hearing, and it's good to actually talk about them. So Israel's a colonizer. You know, we've kind of talked about, are they doing ethnic cleansing? They're not. It's not genocide. But there's still the question of, are you living in Palestine right now? What's always been known Palestine? Because apparently Israel came to exist in, what would it be, 1948? Is that the date? 1940? 1948. Right, but for a lot of people, that's when the Jews came in and colonized the area of Palestine. Can you, to the best of kind of your ability, walk us through that idea of why aren't Jews the colonizers? Did Israel just suddenly begin to exist in 1948, or is there more history to that? And are you living in Palestine right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge question because the history is thousands.
There's
of
a
years,
lot. Yeah, there's a
thousands
lot.
of years. Yeah, in the short answer, it's Israel. But also you can't deny the Arab connection, the Palestinian connection to the land as well. That has also existed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So the word Palestine, if people don't often know where that came from, the word Palestine, it came into being when the Roman Empire renamed the region after they had conquered it. There was many Jewish like revolutions and revolts against the Roman Empire, because at that time, before the Roman Empire, you had like something called the Hasmonean dynasty, which was a dynasty of Jews that lived in the land. Maybe you've heard of like Hanukkah, Judah Maccabee, figures of like this Hasmonean dynasty that existed. This is a little bit before the time of Jesus. And then the Roman Empire eventually came, they conquered, you had many Jewish revolts. Eventually there was expulsions that the Roman Empire did, because they got tired of the constant Jewish revolts against them, and they renamed it Syria Palestina. And that was one of the first times you had this term Palestine essentially being called to that region of land itself. It wasn't
Got it.
known as idea of Palestine. That word didn't really, it wasn't used essentially to describe a region of land until the Romans began calling it that. And if I'm correct, they called it that because of the ancient Philistines that were ancient enemies of the Israelites. And so it's kind of like
Like a
rubbing
middle
it
finger to the
in the face.
Jews.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like you tried to
Yeah.
fight against us, revolt us, like we kicked you out, and now we're gonna call the land after like your ancient enemy, basically. And then it ended up sticking for a long time. And I think now the word has different meaning, I think to different people has different meaning. I think maybe to some people it signifies autonomy, a nation of its own for the Palestinian people. But understanding that word and where it came from is important because prior to the Romans renaming it Syria Palestina, it typically was known by different terms, but Israel was one of them, right? Ancient Israel. And you had an ancient Jewish population that lived here. And I won't get into it, but the archaeological evidence is like enormous on it.
Enormous. Yeah.
Read the Bible.
Read the Bible. You can leave it at that. Just read the Bible.
Yeah, and there's other things. Josephus was another historical writer during the time, and he documented multiple things, multiple different. You have the Dead Sea Scrolls that were documented before the time of Jesus, which Bible scrolls, but written by people we know that clearly believed in the Bible, read it even prior to the time of Jesus. That lived here, would have been Israelites or Jews, essentially. So yeah, there's an enormous Jewish connection to the land. It goes for thousands of years. The idea of Jews being white colonizers it's really just ludicrous. It's absurd. There is an Ashkenazi Jewish population. That's where my family comes from. Ashkenazi Jews are Eastern European Jews, so they tend to look white.
Right.
I call myself white.
Right.
But there's also a whole Jewish population that didn't come from that area, that has been in the land for thousands of generations and came from many different Middle Eastern countries. If you live in this, if you come to Israel and you talk to the population, you're not going to see white people all the time. You're not. You're going to interact with Jews from Iraq. You're going to interact with Jews from Iran, Jews from Syria, Jews from Yemen, Jews from here, Jews from Ethiopia. There's a whole Black Jewish population here from Ethiopia that exists in this country. You're going to interact with many Jews that are not white. So it's one of the most ludicrous things I've seen, this idea of it being a white colonization state. It's people that don't understand the actual population, the actual demographics, who lives here, Jewish history of the land. I think it's a move people do because other political issues that are going on. It's a quick way to make a connection. People like things they're familiar with. So if you can label something white supremacy, it's easy to get all the people on your side now immediately. Because you connect to something they're familiar with, maybe going on in the US or other places in the world.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's a big misunderstanding for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's probably connected to the idea. I mean, I think if you kind of big picture, there's a general attack on the ideals and the values of the West, right? And Israel is the West and the East. That's how I consider it. It is the, and people usually people say, well, it's the only democratic. Yeah, but it's not just about democracy. We're just talking about the general values of the West, and the way that the narrative has tried to take down the West is by using the word colonialism, right, and colonizer. And as the West has been evil from its start, blah, blah, blah. That's a whole different podcast. But then it's just saying, well, if Israel's the West and the East, then they must be colonizers too. But that is a category error. I mean, that is not even the same conversation.
Right.
At all.
My opinion is it's just not super intelligent rhetoric anyways, because at the end of the day, there really is no indigenous population living here, right? It's a kind of a combination of Jews that have come from all over the world, Jews that have lived here for a long time, and the same with the Arab population, right? The Palestinian population is Arab, which is not indigenous to this specific region. The ancient, maybe indigenous people, they don't really exist. Some people might call them like the Canaanites, right? We read about them a bit in the Bible, but if you talk to archaeologists and people that study the history here, they would all tell you the ancient indigenous population isn't really existent at the moment. They kind of just disappeared over the years. And what we have now is a combination of people that have moved here and intermarried over thousands of years. And so this idea that the indigenous population is Palestinian Arab population and Israelis are simply white colonizers, it's absurd. It's really just not logical. It's a misunderstanding of history. If you want to be honest, there is really no indigenous population at the moment. It's a mix of it's our land, it's Arab land, it's kind of a combination of people that have lived here for a long time, but we can't really call them or ourselves the true indigenous population. It's a misunderstanding of the ancient history of the region.
Yeah, I think that's a very balanced view to it, which kind of takes me to my next question, which can be probably answered pretty quickly. But there's also a saying that we hear chanted on college campuses or anytime people support Palestine. I see it in TikTok comments all the time. And either someone will post a Palestinian flag or say, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." What does that even mean?
Yeah, I mean, many people don't know basic landmarks. I've seen so many videos of people chanting this, and they'll give them a map, and they'll say, "Okay, point to the river." They have no idea
And
what
point
it
to
is.
the sea. They have no idea.
So I'm looking at it right now. Like the Mediterranean Sea is right in front of me. So that's the sea that they're talking about. It's on the east bank of Israel, essentially, on the east side. That's the Mediterranean Sea. And then on the western side, you have the Jordanian River. And so river to the sea, everything in between. That's Israel, right? We call modern state of Israel. So I've talked to people, and some people have different ideas of what that phrase means. And so again, you have to ask someone, when you say this, what do you mean by this? Is this simply a chant saying you believe that there should be in the future a Palestinian state, right? That Palestinians also have a right to autonomy and self-defense and these kinds of things, right? Basic human rights. If that's what you mean, I don't see this as a racist or problematic thing. It's a slogan, but I think for many other people, that's not the situation. What they're saying is from the Jordanian River to the Mediterranean Sea, all of in between what we know as modern Israel, that's actually Palestine. And it's again going back to this idea of Israel doesn't exist in the heads of some of these people. They don't believe Israel is a legitimate state. It has a right to exist. It has a right to self-defense. It's all Palestine. There is no Israel. So when you say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, you're essentially, in some people's minds, calling for the eradication or the dismantling of the state of Israel. And that's a problem.
That's a big problem. Yeah.
The geography from the river to the sea, in between that includes the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel. So you have to ask people what they mean by this, but typically it is a problematic saying. It can be seen as calling for destruction of the state of Israel.
Yeah, I think you're right about that because I've seen like on TikTok a lot of times like it can be the most random video, but then you'll see like someone post on the comments the Palestinian flag, and then people will reply to that, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And you're right, not a lot of people know that, and for what it seems in the major protests that we're seeing, and we saw a lot during college campuses or even the rise in anti-Semitism, people keep chanting that. So I think you're right. It's important to ask somebody, hey, what do you mean by that? And it's also important to know, sometimes we can know what they mean by that, and at least by the other words that they say, but at least I wanted to inform those who are watching right now who've never heard that, and you're like, oh, that's an interesting chant, what it can mean. It doesn't mean it means like that, when someone says it right off the bat, but what it can mean is a total eradication of Israel as we know it, and saying, hey, Jews don't have a right for their own country, even though everybody else has one. And I thought, going back to what you were mentioning about just the whole thing of, is Israel the homeland of the Jews from thousands of years ago? Is it just Palestine as we know it? I thought it was a very balanced response, that there's obviously a lot more history of Jews in that land. I mean, just read the Bible. It's very credible, archaeologically speaking, everything. And then when you're talking about the last few hundreds of years, then there are also other Arabs, not other Palestinians. Correct me if anything here I'm saying wrong, but not other Palestinians that come and settled in Palestine. It was other Arabs that came and started settling in the land as we know of Palestine, right? And that's a very long, complicated history, I'm sure. I mean, I did a little bit of a breakdown after October 7th when there were a lot of those lies of Israel being colonizers and everything. But I want to ask you one last question kind of regarding the actual war that is going on right now. You kind of hinted at it, but another narrative that we're seeing is that Israel's committing not only genocide. Now we've established that's not true, but that they're just committing war crimes in general. Just war crimes, and they're bombing schools, they're bombing synagogues. There was a story that was
I think you're right about that.
Mosques, not bombing synagogues. Thank you for correcting that. Well, like you said, on October 7th, they were saying that the Israelis did that.
Yep.
So sometimes it makes no sense how far people will go to lie. But one of those narratives is that they're bombing mosques, they're bombing schools, they're bombing any other type of civilian apartments and all that, just for the sake of bombing them, or just going nonchalant. Let's carpet bomb and see if we hit Hamas, if we happen to hit them. Is that accurate, or just based on your information that and your experience, what's actually going on when it comes to the Israeli kind of strategy of getting Hamas?
Yeah, I think honestly, this is our generation's lack of understanding of how war is. We haven't really seen war as Americans. We don't really know what it's like. Those things are happening. Like, it is true. Israel is bombing mosques and maybe sometimes hospitals or schools, apartment buildings. And there's a lack of understanding why they're doing this. Hamas, I mentioned this earlier, but there's a terrorist organization. We know what they do. We know what they stand for, what they want, and we know how they operate. So they operate within civilization. Everything that's civilian, that's what they want to operate with. They use civilian shields. They know when they operate within a civilian society, there is more likely that civilians will get hurt, which helps them because now Israel is the bad guy. And then it protects them because then Israel will sometimes hesitate doing something because of the risk they might commit injury or kill a civilian. So Hamas thrives with this. They thrive by operating within a civilian society. It works for their benefit. And Israel has to fight a war, right? They had, that's the thing I'll ask friends or ask people, like, what should have Israel done after October 7th, right? There was a border. You had Gaza, you had Israel. Gaza, just to understand the history of it, it's important to understand. Gaza was under Israeli occupation, and then in 2005, Israel removed all of its troops from Gaza and evicted every single Israeli and Jew in the land. All of them left Gaza. Since 2005, Gaza has been under Palestinian authority for almost 20 years. There's been no Israeli control. There's been no Israeli authority. There's been no soldiers, no Jews. It's a district of Palestinian land that's been run by Palestinian authority. Unfortunately, that authority is Hamas, right? But in that 19 to 20 years since they've had control over the land, Hamas only used that to build a society in which they could attack Israel. They built miles of tunnels. They spent so much billions of dollars in building tunnels underneath Gaza that they could use in a war, which they're doing right now, also to hold hostages in, and then to try to dig into Israel itself to then commit attacks inside Israel. They spent billions of dollars on rockets. They fired thousands upon thousands and thousands of rockets indiscriminately at civilian cities, doesn't matter where. They purchased weapons, RPGs, whatever. All that money that they've used for almost 20 years, that billions of dollars, never went into developing society of Gaza itself, right? I can only imagine what Gaza could have looked like if Hamas, instead of investing into warfare, invested into its own people. They would sometimes do that. They do sometimes will build schools or build mosques, but then they use those things to store rocket launchers, right? To store weapons, to hide hostages. So when Israel goes into Gaza to fight Hamas, because they had to do something, right? What was the option after October 7th? You had they were separate, they weren't mixed. And then when they attacked and crossed the border with thousands of soldiers, kidnapped and did their war crimes, Israel, what were they going to do? Like, no country would sit back and just let this happen. No country. They couldn't just watch hundreds of their civilians go back into Gaza under Hamas authority and control, being kidnapped, children and elderly and families, and do nothing and just try to negotiate. It's unrealistic.
That's
There,
completely unrealistic. And I
right.
didn't want
Mean to interrupt you, but you mentioned this. I think we are at the beginning, or maybe it was when we were off camera. But it's the unrealistic standard
Hmm.
that has been
Yeah.
set on Israel.
as if like we don't live in the real world. It's almost like they're wanting to. It's an odd reference, but they're wanting to play like Age of Empires, some type of game, and they're start playing with all the settings for Israel, and they say Israel's not allowed to do this, not allowed to do that, not allowed to defend itself, not allowed to go rescue its people, and somehow if it does any of that, it's violating something.
Yeah. And it's getting a little more deeper into it, but I think to understand in warfare, um, look, they have objectives they're trying to get. They're trying to get back the hostages, and they're trying to take out as much as Hamas as they can. And the army's duty, it is to protect civilians as much as they can, but ultimately it's to the Israeli soldiers as well, right? I mentioned many of them were in reserves. They were people working in everyday society that got called up that now have to fight. And the job of the Israeli army is to protect its own soldiers. And so when you're in these situations, when there's snipers in buildings shooting at your unit while you're trying to cross from one building to the next, you're stuck. And if you call an airstrike, it helps prevent the situation of seeing your buddy next to you get shot. I've heard horror stories already from the war of terrible things that happen, but Hamas is armed. They have killed and they have injured thousands. They injured thousands and killed hundreds of soldiers. So it's a war zone, and that's what's horrible about the situation. It doesn't take away any of the trauma or the pain or the tragedy of what's going on to Palestinians and to Gaza. It doesn't take away any of this. It's very real what's happening. Like, and this is what I make sure people understand. It's not to deny the suffering of what's going on in Gaza, right? It's very real. There is suffering there, tremendous. And most of the civilians that are suffering, they didn't do anything. They're stuck under the authority of Hamas, right? And it's sad. It's very tragic. It's very sad. And it can't be ignored either. It is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. But people need to understand there's a big difference between an army fighting a war they didn't ask for. Israel didn't want this war. Trying to fight that war in a civilian society against a radical terrorist organization that's using society to fight you. All those things are very different, which creates a situation of a humanitarian crisis that's very different than genocide and indiscriminate war crimes of killing. They're not the same thing. And it's not understanding these. There is nuance in this situation. There is a difference between what we saw armies like Nazi Germany when they committed genocide. It's very different than, for example, what the IDF is trying to accomplish in Gaza. It's not the same thing. It's not understanding the situation and what's going on.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's important for people to understand that. And especially, this episode is for everybody, but especially the young generation that is consuming all these news and all these narratives. And now, one other thing that I've been told, or at least through social media, it's like, here, Israel's one more thing out of a million things going on in the world. You know what I mean? Why? You've heard that even for funding, about cutting funding to Israel. It's like, hey, we got plenty of problems here in the U.S., so let's just not worry about what's going on in the Middle East. There's always been problems in the Middle East. Let's just kind of let them deal with that. Why, in your perspective, do you think it's important? I'm not talking about what you think it's important for the American government to support Israel. Obviously there's reasons, but just as people, why is it important for us to actually care what is going on right now in the Middle East? Not only with Hamas, but with Hezbollah in the north, the Houthis, and everyone else.
Yeah, I think it is important to care about what goes on globally, especially if you're a believer. We're called to make a difference in this world, to be a light. And if there's other believers too that are suffering, then I think it's our job to be for them and to pray for them. But yeah, I think there is a hyper focusing on the issue, to be honest. And sometimes even us ask ourselves, like, why do you guys care so much? Right? Something that Israelis will ask, like, the world, like, there is so much going on. Why do you care so much about what we're doing? Why is this hyper focus in the UN, especially, for example, on everything Israel does, just this hyper focusing on every single thing Israel might have done wrong? and there's so much going on globally. And we ask ourselves, like, we do want people to care, but also it's not like we only want them to care about what's happening here. There's other things going on globally that sometimes gets looked over because of this obsession and this hyper focusing on Israel itself. But yeah, I mean, I would say people should care about it just like they should care about other things that go on. I don't think it's necessarily somehow more important than other issues globally. There's so much going on. The war with, Russia and Ukraine, the issues going on in Congo, North Korea and South Korea. There's just issues everywhere globally and in America itself, right? I don't think it's something we need to care more about. I think it's an important issue, but I think there's a hyper focus on it, which is unfortunate, because it doesn't help the situation itself when there's the hyper focus, and then it neglects other things going on globally as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. There is a hyper focus in our culture, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have this conversation, is because, to your point, there's plenty of things going on around the world, but since there is a hyper focus on this situation, we might as well talk about it, right?
Yeah.
Since I think it was actor Denzel Washington who's like, if you don't watch the news, you're uninformed, but if you watch the news, you're misinformed. And I thought that was quite accurate, at least nowadays. So it's just important because these topics, the Palestinian, well, it's called the Palestinian conflict, but it really is the Israel versus Hamas war. It's one of the many cultural things going on right now in our generation. And it's not the only thing, right? But it is, I think, a major thing that speaks to not just something that's limited by geography, but it speaks to a worldview perspective. Why we should care that it's not just limited to that region of the world, but we're seeing anti-Semitism in the U.S. We're seeing just almost more of a callousness towards anything related to Israel at all. And I wanted to ask you, kind of just bring it home a little bit more. By the way, I honestly super appreciate you just talking and sharing with us your perspective and everything, just kind of being transparent about it, because that's what I wanted people to hear is, hey, we're just two actually regular people. I forgot, like, how old are you, Shaun? 24, I'm 25, right? So here we are in our 20s, and it is crazy that in our 20s, this type of conversation would even be a conversation, in our 20s. I was talking to just some young youth group kids at my church, and we were talking about different things. And it just so happens that the culture we live in, what were the conversations? School shootings, at least, or in the narrative around them, the elections coming up. I mean, there were just some very heavy topics that I'm like, man, I know we weren't probably supposed to be talking about that at our age, but it's just the world that we do live in. So I want to ask you, just as we close a little bit more, just personally, I think it's important, just as Christians, there's a sense of Christianity that detaches itself from Israel or anything Jewish at all. But I want to ask you personally, of course, you said you grew up and your mom is Jewish, your dad isn't, but when you became a Christian, a believer in Jesus, how did that affect your identity as a Jew?
Yeah, I never saw them as conflicting when I grew up. I didn't. I mean, if you looked at all the first believers, right, the 12 apostles and the early church, they were Jews living in Israel, right? Ancient Israel.
Wait, are you saying it didn't happen in America? What are you talking about?
Sorry to burst the bubble. But yeah, so I kind of always see myself similar to that, right? I never saw a conflict in my Jewish identity and the culture and the history and what it means to be Jewish, and in my belief in who my Messiah is. I mean, he's the Jewish Messiah. He came to that region, to that people, and then to the rest of the world. I never saw it as a conflict. I always saw it kind of synergistic, like it worked together in many ways. So yeah, I grew up culturally Jewish, but then my faith always had its main identity, in me as well. So.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that. I think Thank you for sharing. Like, to your point, it seems like kind of an obvious question if you look historically. I mean, you're like, well, I was just like Peter, Paul. Did anyone ask them those questions? But it's just the society that we live in. We get so caught up with like our own culture that some people think that, I mean, just whether it's quote unquote American Christianity or whatever it is, that there's a sense of disconnection from Israel or from being Jewish. And as if, I think if anything, you're more OG than me, you know? So, but that's what's amazing about the faith, is that we're all in the family of God. Well, Shaun, I wanted to, as we bring it to a close, was there kind of anything else on your mind that you want to just to share regarding kind of what we've been talking about, or I just kind of want to leave it open.
Yeah, no, I want to go back to what you had mentioned about just talking about these things, and with our generation especially. There's a kind of funny saying. They say if you ask a Jew, like if you ask 3 Jews an opinion, you're going to get 5 answers because we're very opinionated and we have multiple opinions.
Yeah.
Saying that to start, like this, most of what I'm saying is my view.
Right.
And some of it, I think, is not just an opinion, but just take that, into perspective. But what I love about it is because you're going to hear from the perspective of someone who lives here. And that was one of my biggest frustrations of what's going on in this conflict, is people are getting many information on social media, TikTok, Instagram, and they're not talking with individuals actually living and going through what's happening. And so just having this conversation, even though many of it is my personal experience, the fact is I do live here. Like, I am an Israeli. I live here. I represent the people. And having this conversation is what helps clarify things. It helps get more truth out there. And I really appreciate like you taking the time to just talk to someone and just have a conversation, right? That's how you get. I mean, I really do hope for progress in this issue. Like, I hope for peace in the future, hope for progress. And I think one of the biggest obstacles into what's going on is people just don't want to accept and talk. There's this idea of, if you're Israeli, if you're Zionist, we won't even talk to you, right? And that's an issue because we're part of the problem, right? You can't exclude us. We're not going anywhere, right? Israel's here to stay. The IDF is here to stay. This is our homeland. We have a people. We have a language. We exist, and Israel's not going to just disappear. So there has to be an acceptance of who we are and that we're going to be here. And then discourse. But if you won't even hear from the side because they're Zionists or they support the IDF, right? They're an Israeli. We can never progress to something better. So you taking the time to just have this conversation and hopefully share it to others, I see that as the way of progress, right? Just hearing from perspectives of people that are actually living it day to day, interacting day to day with the people experiencing this as well. That's much better than scrolling on Instagram and getting information from there.
And you're getting information at like 4 seconds a clip, 3 seconds a clip, and everything. I think this is great. I mean, this will attract a certain type of people who like longer formats. But at the end of the day, this is a real conversation. You really can't get anywhere in little snippets or a tweet or an X, whatever it is now nowadays.
Man,
and
but
these are real life issues, right? These are things that are affecting people day to day, every single moment in the country, and to then base your actions on little things you've seen on TikTok and Instagram without truly taking the time to sit down and study and read and talk to people, have these long conversations. Should be careful about having such a strong opinion on something.
What was it? It's another Neil, I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson, who said, I don't know if I'm going to paraphrase it, but he said, the danger is knowing enough about something to think you're right, but not knowing enough to know you're wrong about that. And I think when it comes to this and many other conversations, I think that's our society. We think we know enough to make big conclusions and big statements, but not enough to know that many times we're wrong about those statements. And something that I appreciated, Shaun, is like you mentioned something important. It's many of this is quote unquote your perspective, but there's a lot of stuff that is not just your perspective. And I want to encourage our culture that we live in a culture of relativism, where I guess like, hey, everybody has their perspective. That's not necessarily mean that their perspective is the truth. Like at some point, something has to be true, right? At some point is either Israel's committing genocide or it's not. It's not like depends who you ask. You know, is Israel doing war crimes? Is Israel's goal to eliminate the Palestinian people, or is it not? It does not depends who you ask. Now, when we're talking about, hey, how healthy are the relations between a Palestinian and a Jew? I guess that depends who you ask in general and their experiences. But I will encourage everyone watching, like, there is a certain sense that you can't stand on truth. Not just like, I guess everyone has opinions and here's another opinion. It's important to stand on truth and to take the opportunity that if this ever does come up and people talk about this, that now you're better informed to say, hey, like I get it. Yeah, a lot of different perspectives are out there, but here's what's true and here's what's not true. Because that's the only way that we move forward. You know, that's the only way that we actually build. And we're going through our own things here in the U.S. when it comes to what's true and what's not true. We got election year coming up, so that's fun. How are you approaching election year from Israel? Does that even cross through your mind?
No, it does. Yeah, people are following it here too, because we know what happens there is going to affect us here. So it is a big discussion also here.
Dude, I was gonna ask. Well, I know we were gonna wrap it up, but that was gonna be such a good question. I'm just like, yeah, I was gonna say, how are you guys viewing the election, in terms of its relationship to Israel?
I mean, it depends on who you ask, but
there it is.
I think there's an understanding, like Israelis want someone who is going to stand with them and support them and give them the aid that they need. And much of Israeli aid does come from the US. The Iron Dome, a system that shoots down rockets coming from Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen or Iran, that's supplying these weapons. Gaza, of course, from Hamas. Much of that funding comes from the US. And so Israelis care about what's happening because they want leadership in the US that's going to continue to fund these things, which is for our own safety. So they're definitely watching it closely, hoping whoever gets in is the most supportive of Israel's security in the future. Yeah.
Exactly. No, man. Well, Shaun, I'm extremely grateful for your time. Thank you so much. And for everyone else interested, I would just want to finish with this question. How can we pray for you? How can we pray for this conflict? What are some things that we can kind of actively keep in prayer?
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, big thing is the hostages is on everyone's mind still. They've been in there almost a year now. We don't know the situation for many of them, what they've gone through, but prayers that they would come back to their home in peace. Obviously, the believing community here, there's, again, many soldiers, believers, young men fighting, going through hard things, that keeping them strong and that their faith would, be strengthened somehow through these things most believers in our age are never going to have to deal with and experience and see. And then for protection, for also believers in Gaza and for the situation, the people who are there, for the leadership of Israel needs some help. There's many prayer requests. Those are just a few to come to my mind, but yeah, it's a situation that needs a lot of prayer for sure.
Yeah. Well, I love that. Well, to close, would you close us in prayer?
That would be amazing.
And then we can wrap this up.
Yeah. Dear Lord, thank you so much for Brother Andrew and this time that we have together to talk and discuss the situation here. Pray that you would bless him and his podcast and what he's doing in life, hoping to share the truth and to help people learn more about what's going on, hear different perspectives, perspectives of different believers. Just pray for the situation here in Israel. We pray for the protection of your people. We pray for the protection of believers here in the army in Gaza. We pray for the believing community in Gaza itself, that you'd protect them from all that's going on. Give them strength, give them courage, give them wisdom, give them peace and security, knowing their salvation is in you and their security is in you. Yes. We thank you for your grace and for your salvation that you sent. And in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen and amen. Well, bless you, Shaun. Thank you for being here, and thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode of the AntiIsrael Show.